All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. And if you want access to the graphs used in this video or hundreds of other kinds of graphs across all different types of subjects, there's a free link to a Drive folder in the description. So as we've entered the new year, we got the roundup data for the total GDPs of most countries for 2025. I'm not going through all 197 countries, but I'll run down the list for enough of the top ones and a few random favorites. So starting with the top of the list, obviously the US went from a total economic size of $29.1 trillion in 2024 up to ending 2025 at a total economic size or GDP of 30.6. Although, and the US and China are the only ones I have so far completed the updated inflation adjustment graphs for. If you adjust the nominal or face value at the time GDP numbers for inflation into current dollars, you get a bit of a different picture for each country. And there's also the issue that a lot of that growth that occurred over 2025 was a bunch of stock value AI inflation stuff. But anyways, moving down to China, who at nominal face value has roughly stalled or slowed to a crawl over the last 5 years after having previously been rocketing upwards. They've taken the past 5 or 6 years to climb from 18 up to now just under 19 and a half, having gone over the last year from 18.7 up to $19.4 trillion. Although in real value terms, inflation adjusted, they're actually lower than they were immediately in post-COVID recovery. And again, I apologize for those being the only two that I have updated inflation adjustment graphs for. The other inflation adjusted GDP graphs you'll find in the Drive folder are only going up to 2023 or 2024. India has begun to slow down, this time over the past year, only growing by about 200 billion instead of 300, but crossing over the 4 trillion line, going from 3.9 up to $4.1 trillion. Germany, like many other European nations, has been kind of stuck for a bit, as many of them sort of hit a ceiling over the 2010s. And then over the 2020s, many of them have also had sort of really wild up and down oscillations in their numbers. Over the course of last year, Germany went from 4.7 up to $5 trillion. And Japan has been oscillating wildly between 4 and 5.5 or 6 for several decades now. They peaked back in the 80s and 90s. But anyways, at nominal value, face value, their economy over the course of last year bounced back from 4 trillion up to 4.42. The UK, similar pattern to, again, many of the other European nations, especially over the 2010s. Over the course of last year, they jumped from 3.64 up to 3.96 in nominal value. France, being a bit less wild, has been over the last few years starting to continue climb back up a bit more steadily and predictably, this time having gone up from 3.16 up to 3.21 trillion. Italy, over the past year, climbed from 2.37 up to 2.54 trillion in total size. Russia, over the last 2 years, began designating all forms of economic, energy, all kinds of other data as classified. So no one has real access to true numbers from them anymore, but there's enough stuff floating out there to get sort of vague estimations. And the highest guesses for them at nominal value supposedly puts them around 2.5, which would be a bit of an obscene jump from their pre-invasion numbers of around 1.7 or 1.8. But even working with that and assuming that that is correct, looking at the distribution of things, you get the split graph like this one. Canada is casually making their way up through the lower 2 trillions, climbing last year from 2.24 up to 2.28. Brazil, having taken a massive dive during the 2010s, has been trying to make their way back upwards, and last year looks like they climbed from 2.18 up to 2.26 trillion. Spain stalled out like a lot of other European nations for a while. They seemingly had a large jump last year from 1.72 to 1.89. Mexico has been climbing towards 2 trillion, and although last year they had a bit of a stall out because of all the uncertainty and reduced order stuff, because of all the tariff confusion, And so they only went from 1.85 up to 1.86. Australia is meandering its way closer to 2. Last year climbing from 1.75 up to 1.83. South Korea making an abrupt jump like Spain did over the past year from 1.71 up to 1.86. Turkey continuing to climb up through the ones with two conflicting numbers coming in. They either went from 1.32 to 1.44 trillion last year, or they had an anomalous mega jump from 1.32 up to 1.57. Indonesia around the same locale, continuing to climb up a bit more slowly, this time from 1.4 up to 1.44. Over next to Germany and Belgium, Nederland continues going up now through the 1 trillions after having been a bit around or above, having been a bit around or just below 1 for a bit. This time they jumped from 1.23 up to 1.32. Saudi Arabia only going upwards a bit from 1.24 up to 1.27 trillion, as they did return from 9 million up to their previous 10 million barrel per day plateau last year. However, oil prices crashing back down to under $60 a barrel kind of hindered the actual amount of GDP boost they got from that. Poland has entered the 1 trillion list, ending 2025 over $1 trillion in economic size for the first time, coming in at 1.04. Switzerland just coming over 1 trillion by a few billion, continuing to coast their way forward on all that gold handling. Taiwan is now up into the lower 900s and is climbing their way up, going from 914 up to ending last year at 923 billion. Belgium has been wobbling around like a number of other European countries, and last year climbed over the course of the year from 665 up to 689 billion. Ireland has continued climbing upwards through the 500s and went from 577 up to 587 last year. Sweden continues wobbling around 600 or so, going up a bit last year from 610 up to 620 billion. Argentina continues wildly fluctuating depending on what particular internal crisis of sorts is happening, as has been the case for the last century of its existence, basically. And last year took a swing back upwards from 633 up to 683 billion. Israel taking wild swings around the 500s, and this time actually taking one back upwards and jumping over 600 up to 611 billion. Singapore continuing a steady pace upward, switching its numbers from 547 to 574 billion. The UAE climbing their way through the 500s, going from 537 up to 569. Again, although they're increasing their oil production as well, the crash of the oil price prevented that large of a jump, but the UAE also has a bunch of other stuff. Austria wobbling around in the 500s. This time they went up from 537 up to 559 trillion. Thailand also wobbling around in the 500s, and this time went from 526 up to 559. Norway oscillating around like other European nations, although they're a bit tied to oil and gas prices as well. This time they jumped from 484 back up to 517. The Philippines closing in on half a trillion, climbed from 462 up to 494 billion. Vietnam almost reaching half a trillion as well, going from 476 up to 491. Bangladesh starting to see a pattern of reaching for half a trillion, then crashing back down due to internal crises, reaching up again, crashing back down again. So we'll see how long this continues playing out, but they're on another upswing back upwards this time, going back up to 475. Malaysia, after they hit a bit of a stall and contraction, are on their way back upwards and are up to 471. Denmark is in the 400s as well, this time over last year going from 429 up to 450. Colombia has made it up into the 400s, and last year climbed from 419 up to 438 billion. South Africa has been at higher levels numerous times, but as it continues internally death spiraling in multiple ways, it continues crashing and then trying to climb back up. And it's going for another try back upwards right now, as last year it recovered from 400 back up to 426. Romania has now entered the 400s in total economic size, crossing over and coming up to 423 billion. Pakistan had a severe internal crisis and contraction that they are trying to recover from now and have come back up over 400, coming in at 410. The Czech Republic is almost up to 400 billion, coming in this year at 383. Iran is on its way down for a number of reasons, and keep in mind these numbers are from all of last year. They're not from this year and everything that has started happening this year, but last year they were already on a last year they were already entering free fall and went from 437 all the way down to 357. Egypt had almost reached 500, but over the last few years they've been on their dive downward, and last year fell further from 389 down to 349. Chile is wobbly a bit, sort of in the 300s. Last year went from 330 up to 347. Portugal went from 309 up to 338. Finland, Suomi, has entered the 300s and last year jumped up to 315. Peru has just made it into the 300s, going from 289 up to 303 billion for their total economic size. Kazakhstan has also just entered the 300s, going from 288 up to now 301 billion for their total GDP. Algeria is getting close, going up from 264 up to 288. Nigeria is rebounding after getting close to half a trillion and then crashing all the way down under 200 billion. They have now taken an upswing back up to 285. Greece is coming close to 300 again, I believe. I'm pretty sure they were there before. I might be wrong. This time they went from 257 up to 282. Iraq contracted a bit from 280 down to 265, as last year they did not increase their oil production by as much as others, and the oil price contracted as well. New Zealand continuing to sort of hang out around 250 or 260 this year, or last year technically, coming in at 263. Hungary making their way up through the 200s, coming in now at 240 billion. Qatar dropping by one from 223 down to 222. Ukraine was around 200 pre-invasion, and in the year of the invasion, they dropped down closer to 100, and they've steadily made their way back upwards since then, but have only just now made it back up to around that level, coming in at 210. Kuwait declining a bit from 265 down to 261 billion, as again, they did not go up by that much in oil production last year, and the price collapsed. Morocco climbing up through the mid 100s, going from 146 up to 166 billion for their GDP. Slovakia, Slovensko continuing to climb upwards now, going from 133 up to 147. I did not get the solid numbers for Uzbekistan when I wrote them down on the sheet. I did when I entered them in the graph. So they vaguely went from around 120 or something up to around 140, supposedly. Ecuador climbed from 121 up to 131. Ethiopia has had a abrupt economic contraction from the 150s down towards the 120s area, roughly 100 teens. Guatemala continues climbing upwards through the 100s now, coming in at the end of last year as 121. Croatia is now in the 100s, just barely coming in at 104. Sri Lanka was up at or a bit above 100, I think. With their collapse a few years ago, they dropped way down, but have been on their way back up. And last year managed to make an even bigger jump back upwards from 84 up to 99 billion. Panama was in the mid 80s and this time has come in to 92 billion. Costa Rica, I should have had previously, has now crossed into the 100 billion range and came in at 103. Angola came in just over 100 at 101. Kenya, I should have had further up there as well. Continues climbing up through the 100s and has made it up to 132 billion as of the end of last year, start of this year. Tanzania is getting closer to hitting the 100 range. Last year, jumping from 80 up to 87. A bit to the northwest, Jordan climbed up a little bit from 87 up to 89 billion. Ghana went from the mid or upper 70s up to 86 billion. Tunisia, after having been stalled for a while, is beginning to go upwards again. Last year climbing from 53 up to 59 billion for their total economic value. Latvia climbed from 45 up to 48. Cote d'Ivoire, back down in West Africa, jumped from 87 up to 95. The Bahamas continue climbing now after their initial 2-year COVID gap, and now have exceeded 15 billion for their total GDP for a small country of only about 400,000. And jumping all the way down the list randomly to the currently held place of smallest economy in the world among recognized nations, quote unquote, that belongs to, this time, Tuvalu, one of the small Pacific Island nations of only about 11,000 people, whose economy, among with a number of others, is measured in the millions with an M, not billions with a B. They came in the 60s again, last year actually dropping from 68 down to 62 million with an M. And that's it for this one. Thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon and YouTube, super whatever buttons are all down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. The link to the drive folder with these graphs and hundreds of other kinds of other graphs across all kinds of different subjects is in the description. There's a link to my cat's YouTube channel in the top pinned comment as well. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.